Good evening, everyone. As you see, I will be putting some writing on the screen, but the larger bits of text I will read to you. Because Picasso lived most of his adult life in France, many people think he was French, but he was indeed Spanish, as David has said, born in Malaga and spent his teen years in Barcelona. He was, in fact, proudly Spanish and never took French nationality. As we will see, he was subject to certain relating to foreigners. This evening, I will talk not just about his casting, but the wider economics and practicalities of the period. I sometimes think the talk should have been subtitled, "Not as clandestine as you think." But first, however, a few things about Picasso. I hope that you all know that he made sculpture as well as paintings, as this is rather crucial to understanding what I will be talking about. Unlike his paintings, however, he made continuously, he made sculpture only sporadically periods, and a particularly fertile was in the late 20s, early 19th, when he made series of sculptures, mainly in plaster. Now, another technical hitch. There we go. On the 3rd of September, 1939, when Britain and France declared war on Germany, Picasso, with his friend and secretary Jean Sabates, and his current maîtresse de titre, Dora Maar, they drove through the night to Royan on the Atlantic coast, where Picasso's previous mistress, Marie-Thérèse Walter, and their daughter, and her and Picasso's daughter, Maya, were on holiday. Quite a party, that one. Royan, as you can see, is 500 miles from Paris. But having arrived there, Picasso found that as a foreigner, he had to have a special residency permit to stay in Royan. So on the 7th of September, the three of them drove all the way back to Paris for just one day to get that permit. This flit to Royan left the New York Museum of Modern Art in the lurch, as over the summer of '39, Picasso had been having some sculptures cast for Alfred Barr's famous exhibition, Picasso, 40 Years of His Art, that would open eventually on the 15th of November, '39, but not with any of these new casts, because Picasso had done absolutely nothing to get them to the shipper on time. Picasso would stay in Royan for a year, but he did make several more trips back to and from Paris, and he would continue to cast sculptures into bronze in Paris. With the German occupation of France, bronze became a strategic metal. The Germans wanted it. So what I am about to describe, I hope, will unpick a number of myths. What you now see on the screen is the first account to be published of the casting Picasso had done during World War II. It was written by the American art dealers Harriet and Sidney Yanis. It says, Picasso's work, for example, included surreptitiously casting in forbidden strategic metals the plasters he had made during the war, as well as most of the earlier sculptures of the 1930s. This feat he had accomplished with the aid of resistance friends who made frequent nightly trips between his studio and the underground foundry. The plasters and bronzes were transported under the very noses of the Nazis, cleverly concealed in wheelbarrows and carts ostensibly filled with rubbish. This account is in the 1930, no, hang on, we've missed a slide. I don't think I can go back, sorry. There we go. This account is published in 1946 in Yanis's exhibition catalogue, Picasso, the Recent Years, 1939 to 1946. And they include this grainy photograph with the caption you see on the screen. Their description, with its air of mystery, is strikingly similar to the one the photographer WWII gave in his book, Conversation avec Picasso. He referred to seeing bronzes in Picasso's studio back in September 1943, claiming there were more than 100 new bronzes, of which at least 20 are very large. His account was published only in 1964, and said to be written from notes made contemporary to the observations, but nobody has found the notes yet. The point I'm making is that neither of these stories were told at the time the work was being carried out. They were recounted after it had ceased. In fact, after the liberation. Both accounts do originate from Picasso, and with their references to forbidden metals and clandestine deliveries, they give the activity an element of cloak and dagger. They have been taken as showing Picasso's resistance stance. He was not, however, a member of the resistance. At the outbreak of war, Picasso was casting with the foundry of Claude Valsoine, situated in the outskirts of Paris, in the suburb of Malakoff, which is sort of round here. The foundry by then was run by Claude's son, Marcel, and Picasso had used them since 1935. It was Valsoine's who he had asked to cast the pieces for Alfred Barr's show at MoMA. As I've said, Picasso's sculptural work was always sporadic. And I've told you this bit, that he made a particularly fruitful period in the late 20s, early 30s. These he made at his chateau at Bois-Galou. These photos are also by WWII. For these Picasso, for these plasters were the, for Picasso, these plasters were the sculptures, a halfway stage to becoming bronzes, which is normally the case. But plaster is fragile, and with the onset of war, Picasso was concerned for their security, especially as French soldiers stationed at Bois-Galou during the Phoney War that ran from October 39 to April 1940, had amused themselves by balancing some of Picasso's sculptures on the windowsills and shooting at them. Thus, he decided to have his plaster sculptures cast in more durable. However, Marcel Valsoine Valsoine's letter in May 19 had all sorted out another caster. This was an obscure caster called F. Small in now Courbevoie is, if Malakoff is down here, is where today La Défense is. It was written 4 days before the Germans arrived. And I'll read it to you. Here it begins to change for the worse. I haven't closed my eyes for the last 2 nights due to the noise of the cannons that are nearer to us. Night I stayed in the Tuileries Gardens until midnight. From Saint-Ouen, in the direction of Saint-Ouen, the heavens were streaked by gunshots and explosions. As I can't sleep at night, I hear the entire racket from the front. A friend who has just come from Gisors told me that if the Germans were there and were heading on to Poitiers, I think you told me that all your works had been moved in a safe place. The area of Saint-Ouen is in the north of Paris and includes what is now the Clinical Market, and Gisors is where Picasso's chateau was, northwest of Paris. With the signing of the armistice on the 22nd of June, France was divided into several zones. In Royan, Picasso found himself not only in the occupied zone, but in the coastal zone interdit. So he returned to Paris on the 24th of August, 1940, at a time when many who had fled the capital as the Germans advanced on the city in what was called the Exode were now returning. Picasso would remain in Paris throughout the rest of the war and appears to have been protected by his fame. Picasso had featured on the cover of Time magazine in February 1939, and the threat of international press uproar, should he have been arrested, may have been a factor in the Germans leaving him to live quietly in Paris throughout the occupation. Fame is also an argument that Very and Fry used to do with Marc Chagall when he was arrested down in Marseille. Guastini had been given the 3 sculptures to cast in April 1940, and he finally completed and delivered the casts in November of that year. This is the only work Picasso would give him to do. Perhaps it was now apparent his foundry was too small for the amount of casting Picasso now wanted done, or maybe Guastini was too slow or Courbevoie was too far. We know absolutely no more about him. At any rate, by late 1940 or early 1941, we find that Picasso had begun using yet another foundry, that of Emile Robici, again in Malakoff, about a 15-minute walk from Valsoines. Through extraordinary happenstance, the invoices the Robici foundry gave Picasso for the work they did for him over the following 3 years have survived. Hence, we now know Picasso cast around 77 pieces with Robici in 2 years, 41 and 42, 47 of them for himself, and 29 of other pieces by his friend, the Catalan sculptor, Apel Lefenosa, which he paid for him to have cast. 47 pieces of his own work he had cast in 2 years is almost twice as many as he had made with Valswani, during the preceding 5 years, which was between 22 and 30 pieces. Picasso stopped having bronzes cast at the end of 42, possibly early 43. The reason given for him stopping casting was lack of metal. And when Picasso stopped casting, it did coincide with a law coming into force that enabled the German military authorities to close any enterprise they deemed non-essential to the war economy. You would have thought art bronze casting could not possibly have appeared essential. Brazil said there was no more metal available. And as will be shown, as we will see, art bronze foundries did continue to cast beyond that date, and one might reason Picasso could have continued also. But first, I'm going to give you a broader picture of the wider war economy and its influences on the supply of the necessary metal. It's important to say that bronze as an alloy does not have a set recipe. Copper is its main constituent, with smaller additions of zinc, tin, and other metals. Before the occupation, 80% of Europe's copper consumption was imported. With the German occupation of France, from then on, all of France's needs and Germany's demands on France had to be met from existing and obviously diminishing stocks. Problems with supply were inevitable. This goes for metals other than copper. In 1940, Germany took so much non-ferrous metal and their ores from their occupied Western territories that General Thomas, the head of the German Office of Economics and Armaments, believed that this accounted for Germany's lack of serious shortages of such materials throughout 1941. At the beginning of the occupation, large quantities were taken from the French military, but a substantial amount was also acquired from a voluntary metal salvage campaign the French government had run during the Phoney War. But in the absence of organized transport, that's French organized transport, the metal collected, piled up on regional collection stations, local town halls, or railway stations. There it stayed until the Germans arrived and removed it for their own purposes. In July 1941, the French Vichy government launched another voluntary program for the collection of metal. This time, rather than being aimed at industry, it was to collect everyday items, especially those of non-ferrous metals. This is when the bistro counters, the copper cooking pots, and things like protective metal strips on stairwells disappeared. Surveys were sent to hotels and restaurants asking for objects not vital to those businesses, and inspectors would remove overlooked items, which makes you wonder how voluntary it was. The campaign was unsuccessful, surprise, surprise, and led to the removal of public sculpture for its bronze. In Paris, between November 1941 and February 1942, over 60 public sculptures were removed. More were scheduled for removal, but were saved by transport and labor shortages. By 1943, Germany had obtained over 800,000 tons of non-ferrous metals and their ores from France as scrap. This line that I've highlighted is not the sum of the other figures above. It's only for scrap. Jewish expertise was crucial to the smooth running of the French salvage efforts. It was they who had the knowledge for the sorting and processing of metal. There was a genuine reluctance by the French to eliminate all the Jews, and proposals were made to allow them to keep working in the scrap trade, but to no avail. Unwillingness to go along with these German policies, as well as the strain they exacted, can be seen from a pencil note scrawled anonymously on the French translation of a letter from the chief of the service Alta Material du Mittag, something I can't pronounce, in Frankreich, to the Secretary General of the Salvage Service, dated 10th November 1942, saying that somebody needed to write a letter to the head of Interior Affairs Division, drawing attention to the inconveniences of these Aryanization. How much Picasso understood about all this, we do not know. He would certainly have seen the stripped counters and the empty pedestals. And these photographs were taken before the occupation, but I draw your attention to, not to the famous people in the foreground, but to the metalwork in the background that was no doubt removed. Thus, having found the hook on which he hung his hat gone, Picasso may have reflected on the security of his own bronzes. He was aware he was designated as a degenerate artist, and he would not have wanted his work requisitioned for the war effort. When he was in Rayan, documents indicate that bronze casts were delivered to number 25 Rue de Grande Augustine, which was Picasso's store. Later, in 1943, Brazil spoke of seeing the bronzes in Picasso's studio at number 7 Rue de Grande Augustine. Later still, Brazil referred to plasters being at number 25. So Picasso seems to have reorganized things to keep an eye on the bronzes. Germany took reparations from France, not just as non-ferrous metals, but also as manufactured goods. And from autumn 1940, Vichy introduced economic controls, rationing, complex supply systems, and complex supply systems for raw materials and mandatory declaration of stocks of materials. With livelihoods dependent on having raw materials with which to work, not everyone complied. And this motivated a second period of hoarding. The first, it comes as no surprise, was when the German army was advancing swiftly on Paris. We are told the Rudier foundry was allotted bronze by the Germans to cast the work of Hitler's favorite sculptor, Arno Breker. But Eugene Rudier told Breker he already had enough undeclared materials to fulfill all of Breker's needs. These needs, according to Breker, were somewhere between 60 to 80 tons of bronze, a negligible amount compared to the volume needed for armaments, Albert Speer is reputed to have said. This contrasts with what we have roughly calculated all Picasso's wartime casting took, which is a bit over half a ton. Ingots do not look particularly large. This is my foot for the scale of it all. The ones on the floor, not the metal in the buckets, anyway, the ones on the floor weigh approximately 70 kilos, which is roughly enough to cast La Femme aux Robes Longues, which is 161 centimeters high. If I can just go, burying them would not be difficult, even in larger quantities, especially if you had an earthen foundry floor. In June 1941, 80% of Paris's metal industries were small businesses, and overall the metallurgical sector, even small businesses, benefited from the war economy, and few were forcibly closed. But for small, specialized artisanal businesses, this may have involved diversification. Still, earning a living was important, and in 1940, when Guastini had paid work from Picasso in his métier, he had remained in Paris throughout the exode. When German troops closed in, he panicked and returned the money he had been given as a deposit to Picasso's dealer, Daniel Henry Kahnweiler. A month later, reassured that Armageddon was not going to occur, he went to retrieve the money to begin casting again, but he found Kahnweiler, who was Jewish and German, had left town, not wishing to be there when the German army arrived. As previously mentioned, the Rodier foundry continued casting all through the war, but for the Germans, casting Arno Brecker's work for his exhibition at the Paris Orangerie in 1942. You will notice that some pieces still seem to be plasters, indicating Rodier may not have been able to cast everything Brecker wanted. Thanks to the Société des Animaliers, the foundry of Suze Frère also continued to cast all through the war. Their clients were also probably German. In 1941, the Fonderie Coopérative des Artistes cast art bronzes. They were orders they had gained from the Exposition Universelle in 1937, and they would have gone on to cast more, but are documented as being unable to obtain the necessary bronze. However, they were known for not holding stocks of metal, as was normal for other foundries, a factor that led to that foundry's liquidation. Thus, we learn other foundries must have had pre-war stocks, be they hidden. Significantly, there is no suggestion that any of this work was either clandestine or resistance motivated. This map, with all its millions of arrows, is a map of Amalekov, showing the fine art foundries we understand were working during the war. It shows only the fine art foundries and not any other small metallurgical workshops that were undoubtedly there. True, Malakoff is a suburb and less controlled than central Paris, but given the number we see, it is difficult to argue that all of this activity was clandestine. We also understand that many foundries continued to advertise in the commercial directory, the Botin, which is not a clandestine thing to do. This does, however, make Picasso's activities look less out of step. The generic titles Rubicki used on his invoices, such as Petite Statue, make identifying many of the pieces impossible, but a correlation between size, complexity of casting, and cost can be seen. Costs that escalated over time, especially as the value, oh, hang on, we bounced again. This is a quote between Doromar and Jean Cocteau. And the French franc, the value of it seriously went down and continued going down to the 1960s when it was revalued. Then in April 43, Rubicki invoiced Picasso for 18 pieces, most of which we think were cast in plaster, not bronze. This invoice certainly included the casting in plaster from the clay original of Le Homme au Mouton, that after the war, Picasso would get Valsuani to cast in bronze. That April 43 invoice includes what I believe was the last piece Picasso asked to be bronze cast during the war, a piece called by Rubicki La Guerrière, which we think is Head of a Warrior. Which was before. We have a few clues as to where the foundries obtained their metal, whether it was from scrap, the black economy, or other sources. The Picasso Bronze Project, of which I am a part, have analyzed the metals of those bronzes at the Musée Picasso National in Paris. And for this period, we found two wildly differing groups. However, the Musée Picasso Paris does not hold all of Picasso's bronzes, so we've not been able to analyze all of them and get a full picture. The final piece, this Head of a Warrior, which belongs to a Picasso family member, is thought to contain a conspicuous amount of lead in its alloy. For Picasso, his use of bronze had important conceptual elements to it, as it associated it with public monuments and permanence. He would not have wanted an alloy that might make people think of lead or even tin soldiers. This, more than anything else, is likely why Picasso stopped casting. We can trace Rubicki's presence at his foundry into 1944 and beyond, indicating it did not close and that he, at least some of his workforce, was still there and available to Picasso. Rubicki himself would have been too old for service de travail obligatoire, which under the laws of 16th February 1943 said all males between the ages of 18 to 50 had to work as forced labor for the German war effort. But some more words about the economy, of how the economy was affected. I have shown why we think the work was not clandestine, but other aspects are interesting. Rubicki would have been taxed, not on his profits, but on his turnover, which would have been a good reason to do work off the books. Yet Rubicki gave Picasso invoices on his letterhead, and at least in 1941, he stamped his foundry mark on pieces he cast. Throughout their association, Picasso paid not in used franc notes, but by check, and he recorded the bank and check numbers on each invoice as he paid them. It shows a side of Picasso we almost never see. He was said generally to have had little aptitude for organization. Not so, it would seem. These check payments were also in accordance with laws enacted in 40 and 41, stating that payments in excess of 3,000 francs, which these were to be made by check only. Presumably, Rubicki banked the checks. Thus, there was a conspicuous paper trail should any relevant authority look into the matter. It points to this being a perfectly legitimate activity. And finally, a word on the transport. If the work itself was not clandestine, were there not risks delivering the pieces? Vichy's metal collection campaigns that I've spoken about must surely have made openly transporting a degenerate artist's newly cast bronze sculpture worrisome. Petrol for private transport swiftly became impossible to obtain, and in 1940, Zervos had suggested carrying pieces left at Valsuani's on the metro. But among them was Lecoq, which at 66 centimeters high was too large to be carried on the metro. For a while, I wondered if they'd moved them by velo taxi. And here we see some velo taxis and a description by the author Maurice Sachs of moving home in one. The answer is actually much simpler. On his return to Paris, Picasso probably got the art transport firms, an art transport firm to move them. This is a letter in the Picasso archive from the art transport company Poitiers, dated November 1940, I think. Come the autumn, he certainly was trying to use the art transport firm of Poitiers to move pieces. This was the period the Germans began requisitioning vehicles and rationing petrol, and thus this letter has been interpreted as meaning that Poitiers' vehicle had been requisitioned. But it doesn't actually say that. What it is saying is that they couldn't move Picasso sculpture because they had no vehicle available. It could just have broken down, or they could have, no doubt, they could have double booked it. Like art bronze foundries, art transporters also continued to work, and the archive Picasso holds another letter dated 31st December 1943. And this describes the problems faced by transport companies. They write of the lack of fuel, the lack of spare parts, and the lack of mechanics to fit the spare parts if you manage to get them. At the time I found the letter, I was astonished that at that date, this company was still there and still trying to offer a good service. However, I should not have been, as you must all know about the German looting of art from Jewish collectors by the Einsatzstab Reichleiter Rosenberg, as well as of the taking household items right down to the light bulbs stripped from Jewish apartments for the Aktion Möbel. These programs were enormous. To move them, they used ordinary transport firms. This is in the Cour Carrée. This is a photo taken in the Cour Carrée of the Louvre. In fact, there was so much work for transport companies that for just the 2 months of February and March 1943, the bill for transporting items from just one depot came to, I have to hesitate here, 72,225,760 old francs, which is the equivalent of approximately 18 million euros in 2020. It is possible Picasso's story of clandestinity using the wheelbarrows was just a way of distancing himself from the use of such transport firms, as his sculptures was moved across the courtyard of 7 Rue de Grande Augustine. In 1944, as the war drew to a close, it is industry that shows us the change in attitude to acts done to cling to livelihoods in troubled times. This group encouraged their members to compile dossiers on their resistance activities, suggesting maintenance of illicit stocks was a resistance act. Hiding stocks of metal did deny Germany access to economic resources, but I very much doubt that Picasso and Rubicki were conscious of that while they were actually doing it. Thank you very much.
Claire, you've fulfilled, I don't know whether you can hear me or not.
Yes, well, I can.
You can. Well, that you at this moment in time, you're the most important. You fulfilled and exceeded expectations. Absolutely fascinating. And it's amazing how such a short period of time during such an important part of his life is actually under researched, and your research has revealed a completely clandestine life, if you like, of one of the greatest artists in the 20th century. We have a number of questions, and please, everybody, send in some more. But a fellow sculptor, David Burwile, has asked that you referred to earlier to 47 pieces during this period. Were they actually each individual 47 designs and creations, or did that include editions?
Most of them are unique pieces, cast just one. There are a few where he has two, and I think about one that he has 3 pieces cast, but the majority of them are unique pieces, unique casts.
So in round terms, 40 and a little bit more were actually unique casts.
Yeah, I'd have to go back into my records. Yes, David, that you know.
Well, David would ask that's the difficult question.
Yes, I mean, without fishing about, because the numbers, do your head in.
Sure.
Yes.
Suzanne Desjardins has asked about the fact that he was sculpting before 1932.
Yes.
But in what medium did he prefer at that period, and therefore what the war actually forced him to divert to in terms of raw materials?
Okay. Well, when he first does sculpture, when he's at the WWII, I think it's in clay, and then there's a period he tries some carving in wood, and there is a series of very tall, thin pieces, wooden, I think mainly pine, which he has cast by Florentine Godard. This is before 1935. And then he makes the what do they call the maquettes for the monument to Apollinaire with Julio Gonzalez. No, and they're in iron, and the woman in a garden is a forged piece in iron. He then got Gonzalez to make another copy of that in forged bronze, and then largely I say largely the Bragalu sculptures are in plaster. So then you get, gosh, I have to sort of, the war pieces, he starts using found objects. The woman in a long dress, the body is of a dressmaker's dummy. And I wonder, do we want to go back to that? And one of the hands is a wooden hand apparently from Easter Island that was a gift to him. And he has that cast. And, you know, there's the famous tête de taureau, bicycle seats and handlebars. So he's still making pieces in plaster. And, you know, and they, I don't think it forces him particularly to change.
Do you think the experience actually stimulated further work post-war, or did he actually revert back to norm? If Picasso ever reverted back to norm.
Period is when he's at Valoris, and it's in clay. I'd have to look at my. I mean, I can.
I think I'm interested, and I feel from the audience that they're also interested in his progression through different raw materials and the circumstances as you've identified, much during the war years being forced. But then when he went into ceramics at that stage and painted ceramics, very bright, you know, vibrant color ceramics, was that just another career experimentation, or was that actually part and parcel of this experimentation of different raw materials?
As we know, he's already been using clay.
Yes.
I think the significant thing is possibly that he was starting to use found objects, because if you remember, you know the she-goat, made much later, and there's Woman with a Pram and Woman with a Key. They're all made from found objects, and you can see both the found objects and what he's made them into, which is this double vision. But of course, the very earliest ones are the head of a bull and the woman in a long dress. And I'm trying to think of what other pieces.
Whilst you're thinking, let me just stretch the conversation a little bit, if I may. After all, I mean, Tony Cragg today, many sculptors use found objects, but the interesting thing, unless you can correct me, is that he never transposed that experiment into his traditional paintings. I don't remember knowing of many great collages by Picasso, or am I wrong?
No. Early on with Cubism, he'd made collages.
Yes, but
yes.
But that was some years before he started to experiment with found objects for sculpture. But then he didn't transpose that either. He just...
You're right that I can't instantly. I can't think of a.
I mean, you know, with Picasso, it's very difficult to imagine he didn't do anything.
Julian Schnabel with a, you know, you know, no, I can't think of that sort of thing. Although he does, he paints the sculpture.
Yes.
You know, but so I don't know where that, we think of it as sculpture, but maybe he thought of it as bending his canvas, if you see what I'm saying.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, it's a great temptation for historians to layer an interpretation, but unfortunately, nobody actually originally asked the artist to tell us what the bottom line was.
Yes.
Patsy asks a question in that his sculpture of his wife that you showed, very much in the form of an elephant. Deliberately cruel or simply expressive?
This to do with these women is a tricky one. I think he was much more interested in his art than in the people around him. And it's quite more than possible. It just never occurred to him that distorting things was not flattering. Because what I think he's doing is he's concentrating on what you, in theory, should be doing with art and playing around with that. So he's not thinking, oh, I'm cross with Marie Therese or Dora Maar today.
I'm sure there will be a hunger to have you back on another occasion to discuss Picasso's philosophies and his thought process on all the different ranges of things he created. Yeah. Let me ask you another question, if I may. The Joyce Glasser, no relation, Joyce, but hello.
Hello, Joyce.
She asks the interesting question, given that there are paper trails of Picasso's payments and what he sold during the period, and this leads on to a question I was going to ask.
He never sold.
He never sold during the period?
No.
Ah, okay. But there were paper trails of Picasso's existence and his payments. I mean, he was yes, clearly working.
Yes, that's one of the extraordinary things. On each invoice, in his own hand, he wrote the check number and the bank, which bank, so presumably he has another bank, and the date of payment.
It's he must have had some German blood to be so disciplined and organized. No, but why did the Vichy government ignore it? That's the key thing.
Not just the Vichy government, but the Germans.
Yes, yeah. After all, he was a degenerate artist. He must have been on their wanted list.
I can't really give you a complete answer to that, but he was famous. It's actually quite interesting to think about what would the Germans' attitude have been to an outcry from the international press on any subject. And I was thinking of asking you, David, we got to know about the concentration camps after the war, did we not?
No, that's one of the great fallacies of propaganda.
All right, how much was that in the newspapers?
Well, it's a very interesting question, particularly related within an artistic context.
Yeah.
Ben Uri happens to have acquired over the last 20 years 2 very important works which reflect what was going on in Germany and in Central Europe. The Emmanuel Levy crucifixion from 1942 and then the Chagall crucifixion in 1945. But the Levy crucifixion is fascinating because here is a Manchester artist. This man is living in Manchester, painting in art in Manchester, and paints a most powerful image of a Jew on a crucifix over a military burial ground. It's on benuri.org, and the collection is fully digitized. Just search for Levy and it will come up. 1942, he was telling and protesting what was happening in Central Europe. Politicians knew, the press knew. They may not, of course, they couldn't get into the camps to understand what was going on, but they understood what was happening in Central Europe and in Germany. So the issue of this concept that everybody only found out actually what happened when Pathé News and the troops went in to relieve the camps, and Topolsky was there drawing and everything else. It's a fallacy. It was well known many years before, but there was a political compromise. There was, everybody, as it was always with politicians, as a fudge.
So what you're saying is it was known, but it wasn't actually, across the newspapers. There is also another factor, and I'm going to see if I can, here we go, share my screen, because this is my notes. You can see the inventory of degenerate art in Germany in 1941. I'll move it over. And there's a copy in the National Art Library in the V&A.
Yeah.
And these are my notes because I went through it all, seeing what Picassos there were. And they're the pieces that were removed from the various museums. And you can see in the—
Mr. Gerlitz there.
Yeah, the bold is the museum it's been removed from. Most of them are drawings. But you'll notice, Fischer is the auction house where a lot of things were
in Switzerland. Yeah.
Hello, Gerlitz. But the thing that I spotted with the oil paintings, 25,000 francs. Fischer, this is another oil, 36,000 francs. Now, if you go down the bottom, that makes Picasso a very expensive artist for the Germans. And the only other ones that come close are Franz Marc, Rote Verde, sold at Fischer. Can you see 15,000? A Gauguin, well, actually, never mind Marc, it's Gauguin and Van Gogh, both of which are dead. So, I think they realized possibly they could make money with him. Maybe.
I mean, I'm sorry, I don't want to dictate to dominate this evening, and you and I can talk on these subjects and regularly do at great length. But I would only just throw in one other or two other comments, if I may. One is, of course, this schedule of works doesn't actually refer to the works that were forced sales in German auction houses, where if I said that on occasion there wasn't a great deal of opposition to the German hierarchy buying a painting and therefore buying it at very reasonable prices, that's number one. And number two is, it is said that Picasso during his lifetime expressed political views that in some cases did not appear to be have anti-Semitic overtones. And I'm just wondering whether the combination of commercial interests from all parties, and after all, Brecher was the Nazis' favorite sculptor. I just wonder whether there was a measure of protexia, if you like, that existed. But that's perhaps for another day.
You've managed to read volume 4 of Richardson's biography. So yes, I've got it.
But then only worked for weeks.
Yes, I've only had it for a week, if you see what I'm saying. So I haven't managed to read the crucial bit.
Okay, so I'm very conscious of the time. But let me ask you one more question, which also Patsy asked, and that is that this has been such an engaging and revealing lecture. Have you written a book on the subject? Will you write a book? Will you publish your PhD?
Book, I'm not sure. I've certainly published, I've published 2 articles in the Burlington. One about the casting of La Femme au Robe Blanc, which is complicated and took, you know, from the start of Picasso thinking about it and to, you know, we finally know that it's cast, and it takes a long time. And also one about all the Rabiki articles. I'm not going to recommend it to you because it's a dry read. And I'm now researching, I have copies of 2 years of Picasso's check stubs, 1939 and 1940. The check stubs for the war don't exist, but they're absent all the way up to, I think, 1951. So it's not a case of suppressing just the war years. It looks like an entire box was gone. And trying to figure out what that means in terms of his life. And I already know that Richardson has not picked up on everything. There are things like he pays checks to various people, Wilfredo Lamb being one of them, and Wilfredo Lamb is not in.
Well, that would appear to me to be an obvious omission, but that's for another day. Claire, we will invite you back to grace our Zoom channel. I thank you on behalf of everybody, and really wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to thank Claire in the appropriate way at home, and also to tell you that the series continues next month on the 9th of February, Wednesday, 9th of February, where Dr. Ken Wayne from New York will be talking on Modigliani. Other artists in the program include Gauguin, obviously Auerbach, Kitai. So it's a very exciting program, and it's varied, and it represents the scholarship of Ben Uri within the digital field, which is allowing us to now engage, would you believe, 100 times more individuals than we ever managed to engage physically. So the first full-scale virtual museum is actually working, and it's a matter of genuine pride for all of us involved. So please, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed the evening. Please review, enjoy benuri.org. For the research side, look at buru.org. There's over 300 profiles already published there. We've got another 900 in the works, covering 100 artists from 104 different countries, all of whom artists have migrated to the UK and made a significant and notable contribution to our cultural heritage. So I wish you well, stay safe, and if you can, no doubt have a working party in the garden with wine and cheese, but make sure you're working. God bless everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.